Nobody saw it coming, and that is the most terrifying part, because the signs were there all along for anyone paying close enough attention. For anyone willing to look past the comfortable assumptions and the lazy consensus narrative that had already pre-written this story before a single ball was struck. Before a single serve was launched into the blazing California sky above Indian Wells, and what unfolded on that sun-scorched hardcourt was not just a tennis match. It was a violent, irreversible dismantling of expectation, a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of women's tennis that no seismograph in the sports establishment could have possibly predicted. And if you think this was a fluke, if you think this was a lucky day or an off performance, then you have fundamentally misunderstood what Alex Eala has been quietly, methodically, and devastatingly building toward for the last 18 months of her extraordinary young career. Dayana Yastremska walked onto that court carrying the full weight of her reputation, carrying the resume of a former world number 21, a three-time champion, a woman who had stared down the most hostile environments in professional tennis and survived, a woman who had crawled through the mud of the qualifying draw at the Australian Open and somehow, impossibly, made it all the way to the semi-finals, a woman whose forehand is so violently explosive that experienced coaches genuinely lose sleep, trying to construct tactical blueprints to neutralize it, and none of that mattered, because what Yastremska encountered across the net was not a nervous 20-year-old hoping to steal a set. She encountered something far more dangerous. She encountered a player who had already solved her, who had already reverse-engineered every single weapon in her arsenal and designed a mathematical counter-argument so airtight, so suffocatingly precise, that Yastremska spent the entire match swinging at shadows and wondering how the geometry of the court had somehow shifted beneath her feet. The journey that brought both women to this moment is worth understanding deeply, because context is everything in professional sports, and the context here is staggering in its complexity and emotional weight. Yastremska had been fighting back from the edges of professional tennis relevancy, her ranking having dipped from its peak, her body carrying the accumulated physical toll of years of high-intensity baseline warfare, her game built on an engine that demands perfection of timing and explosive footwork, an engine that is devastatingly effective when every component fires in synchrony but catastrophically fragile when even one piece falls fractionally out of alignment, and Indian Wells represented for her a critical recalibration moment. A chance to remind the sport's power brokers and sponsorship committees that her era was not over, that her particular brand of high-octane, winner-hunting tennis was still capable of competing and conquering at the WTA 1000 level where the sport's real financial and reputational stakes are settled. Eala, on the other hand, arrived in the California desert on a wave of momentum so powerful it had its own gravitational pull. Her Middle East swing had been a revelation. Consecutive quarterfinal runs in Abu Dhabi and Dubai had pushed her ranking up to world number 32, and more critically, had secured her a first-round bye at Indian Wells, meaning she stepped into this match fresh, physically preserved, her central nervous system, unburned by the bruising attrition of an opening round battle, and that physical freshness combined with the psychological confidence of a player who had been making statements on the biggest stages of the sport created a version of Eala that Yastremska simply was not prepared to handle. But here is where the story gets genuinely dark, genuinely psychological, genuinely uncomfortable for anyone in Yastremska's corner, because this was not the first time these two had stood across from each other with everything on the line, and the historical ledger between them reads like a corporate acquisition document written entirely in Eala's favor. Their previous meeting at the Eastbourne Open had ended in a scoreline so lopsided, so brutally one-sided, that it bordered on surreal 6-1, 6-2 on grass, a surface that by every conventional analytical framework should have favored Yastremska's flat, penetrating, low-bouncing power game, and instead Eala had turned it into a controlled demolition, a clinical systematic neutralization of every weapon Yastremska had brought to the fight. And when you carry a scoreline like that into a rematch, when you look across the net and see the face of the player who handed you one of the most humbling defeats of your career, something happens inside the competitive psyche that no amount of preparation or positive self-talk can fully neutralize. Because sport at this level is 50% biomechanics and 50% the stories you tell yourself between points, and the story Yastremska carried into Indian Wells had a chapter she desperately wanted to rewrite. And what happened when the match actually began shocked even the most optimistic observers in Eala's corner. From the very first game, from the very first exchange of ground strokes, it was immediately apparent that Eala had not simply shown up to compete, she had shown up to impose, to dominate the geometry of the baseline, to rob Yastremska of the physical space and the precious split seconds of preparation time that her game absolutely requires to function at anything approaching its potential, and the tactical execution was breathtaking in its cold-blooded efficiency. Eala absorbed pace like a physiological miracle. Every thunderous Yastremska forehand was not merely returned but redirected, angled with surgical precision to corners that forced the Ukrainian into defensive postures that her game was never built to operate from, turning Yastremska's greatest weapon into a liability, making those massive, technically demanding ground strokes work against her because each one demanded enormous physical investment for minimal tactical return, and the math of that equation compounds catastrophically over the course of a competitive match. The crowd at Indian Wells, a sophisticated audience that has witnessed some of the most dramatic moments in the history of the sport on these courts, began to sense what was happening midway through the first set, began to lean forward collectively as the pattern became undeniable, as Yastremska's error count climbed and her winner count stalled, and the expression on her face shifted from focused aggression to something resembling the dawning realization that the tactical script she had prepared for this match was completely useless, and that is when things took a completely unexpected turn, because rather than simply grinding out a mechanical, defensive victory, Eala began to show something the broader global tennis audience had not yet seen from her on this scale. She began to compete with genuine offensive authority, stepping inside the baseline, stealing time, compressing Yastremska's already deteriorating decision-making windows into something barely manageable, forcing errors not just through patience but through the proactive application of pressure that suggested this was not a player waiting to survive but a player determined to conquer. By the second set, the match had transformed from a competitive contest into something closer to a masterclass, a live tutorial on the future of baseline tennis delivered in real time on one of the sport's most visible stages. Yastremska's body language told the story that the scoreboard was still assembling. The shoulders carried differently. The walk between points had lost its predatory certainty. The backswing that generates that legendary power had tightened almost imperceptibly but measurably, and in professional tennis imperceptible changes are the difference between weapons and liabilities, and Yastremska's weapons were becoming liabilities in real time under the relentless, suffocating, geometrically perfect pressure that Eala was applying with the cold calm of someone who had rehearsed this exact scenario 1,000 times in the high-performance laboratories of the Rafa Nadal Academy, where suffering is not considered a misfortune but a competitive skill, where endurance is sharpened into an offensive weapon, where players learn to communicate across the net through body language alone that they are willing to pay any physical price required to win the next point. The national weight sitting on Eala's shoulders during every moment of this match is something the mainstream tennis media has consistently underestimated and underreported. Because when you represent the Philippines, when you carry the concentrated hopes of 110 million people who are tracking every score update at 3 in the morning local time, when you understand that every victory you achieve sends a generation of young athletes in your archipelago the message that the world's biggest sporting stages are accessible to them, the match takes on dimensions that transcend sport entirely and enter the territory of cultural statement, of national identity, of what becomes possible when talent meets the right developmental environment and the kind of iron psychological will that cannot be manufactured or shortcut. And Eala handled that weight on the Indian Wells hardcourt not as a burden but as fuel, converting it into the focused, relentless competitive energy that powered her through every critical moment when Yastremska managed to briefly threaten, when the Ukrainian summoned the desperation of a champion who refuses to accept the mathematical reality closing around her. What happened after that moment changed everything in terms of how the tennis world will now be forced to discuss and position Alex Eala going forward, because this was not a victory over a depleted opponent on an off day. This was a comprehensive tactical and physical dismantling of a proven Grand Slam performer on the biggest stage of the early season, and the implications for the WTA rankings, for the sponsorship conversations happening in boardrooms around the world, for the narrative of who gets to compete for the sport's most lucrative opportunities. Those implications are enormous and immediate. The win placed Eala in position to potentially face Coco Gauff in the subsequent round, a match that would represent not just the next step in a tournament run but a global media event, a corporate showcase, a collision between the current face of American tennis and the most compelling rising story in the sport, a match that would force casual fans and hardcore analysts alike to finally, definitively answer the question that this Indian Wells performance has made impossible to avoid, which is exactly how good is Alex Eala and exactly how high is the ceiling of what she is capable of achieving. The answer that this match has provided, the answer written in the scoreline and the statistics and the tactical brilliance on display throughout the afternoon in the California desert, is that the ceiling may be higher than anyone outside of Eala's immediate circle has been willing to say out loud, because what was demonstrated against Yastremska was not the competence of a promising young player finding her footing at the top level, it was the authority of a player who has already arrived, who already belongs, who is already operating with the tactical sophistication and psychological composure of a legitimate top 10 threat, and the sport of tennis, which has been searching desperately for its next generation of stars capable of carrying the commercial and competitive weight of the WTA into its next era, may have just watched that next star announce herself on the grandest possible stage. And the only question that matters now, the question that will keep every coach, every analyst, every competitor lying awake and recalibrating their assumptions, is just how far this remarkable 20-year-old from the Philippines is actually going to go. Because on the evidence of Indian Wells, the honest and slightly terrifying answer is that nobody, not even her opponents, not even the sport's most experienced observers, knows yet where the limit actually is.